Well, our talk today, since there will be nice and not leisurely, because there's a lot of information, but comfortable, since there are small of us, informal, and we can dialogue in between, you know, if you have any questions while I'm talking. So I'll get going. My name is Jerry Ann Bogus, and I am the director for the Horseman Black Heritage Trail, and also the Harriet Wilson Project, who will we'll talk a little bit about Harriet Wilson today. I'm going to talk a little bit about blacks in New Hampshire, their stories, and their journey and quest for citizenship in our state. And why I want to look at this is just the journey African Americans have taken to become citizens of the country, and the laws that were put in place to actually prevent them or stop them, or the culture. Really, I wanted to start looking at this because of the whole birth certificate thing with President Obama. What does it mean? What does it mean to be a citizen of a place? You know, and what do you do, and what does that citizenship gives you? So that's kind of what I started looking at. And for me, I came to New Hampshire over 30 years ago now, and it wasn't until about 11 years ago, no, it's not even 10 years ago, that I found out that New Hampshire had a black history. I'm originally from Jamaica, and I went to Alabama to school and transferred to school in New Hampshire. And down south, when I was coming up here, they said, oh, you're going to a place that's dark 9 months out of the year. And right. So the Southerners said it was nine months out of the year. And worse than that, there are no black people up there. You know, and I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? Where am I going? I should say, before I went to Alabama, when I left Jamaica, they said that I was going to be lynched. So, I mean, you know, the stories about America and its place, its history of slavery and its history of racism is predominant everywhere. That's the stories that we tell over and over. So, but knowing the story of slavery then changed it to, this is really an American story. It's not located in one particular place. It is the story of America. You know, so the whole notion that, you know, man has the right, liberty, pursuit of happiness and justice should be for all. So in today's talk, I'm just going to tell you the stories of some Americans, their journey for citizenship, their stories up here that complicates this picture of citizenship and what it means to be black in our state. And as this is the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation of 2013, it is really good for me to talk a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation. And this was this was a decree by President Abraham Lincoln on the 1st of January, 1863, that declared that slaves in all the Confederate states then at war in the Union were forever free. And I think we need to know, too, that the Emancipation Proclamation was an act of, it was a war act. It was done during wartime to save the Union, because these states were fighting over the issue of slavery. But this was just a war act. It wasn't done to save the slaves, but it was a way of confiscating property from each of the states that were at war, and we know our slaves were the property. And then there was this gradual emancipation. The proclamation itself didn't free any slaves. It wasn't until, you know, we had the, later on then, as they went through winning each area, that instead of keeping the property, the slaves were gradually emancipated. The proclamation was based on the president's constitutional authority as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It was not passed by Congress, and it was an order of the Army. The proclamation did not apply to all of this, and that was the funny thing too. It didn't apply to everywhere in the U.S. It really just applied to the states that were seceding from the Union, you know, and not the states that had slaves that were still in the Union. So that was really important to know. It was just for the states that were at war. It did not apply broadly. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting to know, because we always say that it was done to save the slaves. No, it really was to save the Union. So, given, right, I think we also need to look at, like, when Lincoln, who ran as a centrist for the Republican Party at that time, he won the vote, the presidency, with only 39% of the vote. And the majority of his vote was from the northern states. So when he won on that anti-slavery ground as a centrist, the majority of the southern states then seceded. The ones that were still in the Union would secede only after there was a rebellion at Fort Sumter in 1861. And then you can see that all of the states then decided. And that was really the impetus of, you know, the Civil War, where all the majority of the southern states decided that they were going to break away from the Union. Lincoln himself had said that even though he ran on an anti-slavery campaign in the North, that if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would. So I think that also helps with changing that dialogue that we always say, you know, Lincoln freed the slaves. No, it really was to save the Union and suppress rebellion. Now, in all this dialogue about slavery, you know, it's always the southern states. You know, we have to save there's slavery in our history, or in our telling of our history, was not a northern institution. It's just down south. And we know, and thanks to Valerie Cunningham, who got me, like I said, just about 10 years ago now. Is it 10 years ago? 2000? Yeah. It's amazing how fast it goes. But I'll tell you that story when we get to it. Through Valerie, that I found out that, hey, slavery did exist in New Hampshire and in Portsmouth. Portsmouth was one of the major ports not in the slave trade, but in our area, that ships would come and we would actually have slaves auctions here. The wharf at Prescott Park was a spot where there were auctions. We had advertisements in our papers for slaves. The whole northern industry, really, as cotton, they say King Cotton, was the biggest taxable income that supplied the U.S. with fund and made us the wealthy country that we are, was from slave labor, because we didn't have to pay for anybody for the labor, and for the other institutions that were part of the slave trade. The cotton mills in the north, the shipbuilders from the north, the road makers in the north, the insurance companies. Everybody was making money off of slavery. And the Northerners were a big part of that story, not just the southern plantation. Slavery for New Hampshire may not look like what it did because of the big plantations in the South. Most of the enslaved people in New Hampshire were small numbers in each household, 3 or 4 enslaved people to a household, and lived in or near the house, not these big slave quarters that we had down south, because the terrain itself didn't lend itself to the big cotton fields of the south. So what I want to talk about here, just after we kind of change what we look at slavery to be in the North, is introduce you to some of the people here from Portsmouth and around the state who, in their quest for citizenship, what they did. Freedom, as the Constitution allows, the biggest thing, all men are created equal. We deserve liberty and justice for all, or whatever, the verbiage is. So I'll introduce you to three really famous enslaved people from New Hampshire that really went and fought for their freedom. And if you've paid any attention to the news lately, you know that we just freed 20 enslaved men from Portsmouth, African men from Portsmouth, from the 1779 petition that was signed by 20 men from African Americans from Portsmouth, who includes, if you look at their last names, famous names from across the state that we recognize: Whipple, Brewster, Barry, Warner, Sherman, and that list goes on. The Prince Whipple, who was one of the major signers on this will, actually was enslaved to William Whipple, who was a Revolutionary War general in this house right here in Portsmouth, the Moffat Ladd House, which is a part of the tour. And so that document, which, thank heavens to the Seacoast African American Culture Center of Portsmouth, is back in our consciousness. And I like to say that it's the ancestors speaking, that, it's 2013 and it's the anniversary of this, the proclamation. So why don't you give us our freedom at this time? I just like to believe that. Prince Whipple. So I have to read some of this. On November 12, 1779, Prince and 19 other enslaved Portsmouth men submitted a petition to the New Hampshire state legislature describing how they had been kidnapped from Africa as children, evoking rational philosophy and Christian theory. They pled for abolitionists. And this is a part from the petition. It says, actually the quote is going to be on part of the burial ground. They use the same language that the Independence Declaration used. So I think what's interesting, what this document does, it allows us to rethink the stereotypes of blacks from those days. The majority culture, the whites thought that blacks were not capable of refinement. They were not capable of writing or thinking in a philosophical manner or irony. And so when you read this document, it changes that perception. And you realize that these men who wrote this petition were in the homes of, where, as in Whipple's case, one of the signers for the Independence Declaration. They were in that environment. So they knew what was going on. They were literate. They could understand, and they were intelligent human beings. What we didn't think that they could do. Another famous African who is Amos Fortune, who's in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. And he came to New Hampshire after he bought his own freedom. He was in Massachusetts first. Where exactly from Africa he is, we're not sure, but we know that in the 1700s he came to New Hampshire. And that's his the tombstone for him and his wife in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. And I like to say he's one of the lucky ones who even today in Jaffrey is still remembered. That's because when he died, he left an endowment for the library and funds for a lecture series. And for even then, we see men of color trying to solidify their place in the town, that they were, thinking of a legacy. We wanted to leave this library on, and it's not just leaving a monetary good, but something that's educational, because that was really important. We see that again in George Blanchard, who I will talk about, and quite a number of them would donate schools or libraries or something that had a nice, strong educational base to it in their journey. Amos Fortune was a tanner, and I'll talk a little bit about the jobs that were open to blacks and what they did, their entrepreneurial spirit to again cement their place in a culture and in the town in which they lived. He also worked and bought the freedom of his first wife and bought the freedom of his second wife. And this is the tombstone for his second wife here. He was a member of the First Church in Jaffrey, and he regularly attended Sunday services. He also helped found the Jaffrey School Library, and he was also very involved in the lyceums of the town. So again, doing just what the founding fathers of the town did, in intellectually, business-wise, and cementing his role in the town. Ona Marie Judd is a next famous enslaved person who, we would say, self-emancipated. She was the enslaved person to Martha Washington, and she came to the Washington household to President George Washington through marriage from Martha. So she was a dowager enslaved person. And she was allowed to really go out in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, because that's where the state capital had moved to for a short time from DC. And there was a strong group of free people of color who were abolitionists in Pennsylvania. And she, through dialogue and through understanding with these groups, was able to, not only desire freedom, but free herself. And how she got out was simply leaving at dinner time. And what is important to note here, it's not only that she was George Washington's day, but the whole thing in Pennsylvania was, if you lived there for 6 months at a time as a person of color, an enslaved person, and were seen as a resident of that state, then a person of color, a black person, a enslaved person, could get their freedom. So what the Washingtons were doing, George Washington and Martha Washington were doing to keep their slaves, they would, every 3 months, they would go back to Virginia and they'd switch them out. So that way they could not establish residence in Pennsylvania. So when Martha told Una that she would be given as a gift to Martha's niece, and it was getting close to the time for them to be taken to Virginia, she decided that she would then take her, she'd run freedom. She'd go for her freedom. And she left with the bustle of everybody packing to go to Virginia. She packed her bag and had, had somebody from the Free People of Color organization get it, and then she was able to walk out and stay with them, the abolitionist movement, until she could find a ship that would take her somewhere, anywhere, away from the enslavement she was in. And lucky for us that we can tell this story, she came to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where she actually worked for about 3 months sewing before she was seen by a Langdon, I forgot her first name, from someone from the Langdon family, and she was recognized as Martha Washington's slave. And that started a flurry of letters from George Washington to Joseph Whipple, who was the collector of the ports of Portsmouth, trying to get Ona to come back to them. And I find this whole notion of these letters really interesting, because here we are, fighting for freedom. Here we are saying that all men are equal, and the president is right in at the top of it saying, please send me back my slave, And he writes in his letter to Whipple, that he, in essence, that he couldn't believe she must have been absconded with, somebody stole her, seduced her, right? Because she's so childlike, and she would never run away. We treated her so well, so please bring her back to us. The whole notion that, and this is from the president, this is part of that whole embedded notion of what blackness means. We see visibly from the top and right across the majority culture, that a person of color could not desire freedom, didn't want to be free. She had to be seduced into freedom, and that we treated her well. We treated her as a child, that she couldn't have a mind enough to think of a way to escape or run away, but she was childlike and needed to be returned to us. The letters on that level really tells us just what the cultural beliefs of blackness is. So in not only working for self-emancipation, working to belong in a place, that the quest for freedom to develop as a person, we also see blacks in New Hampshire working and owning property, and really in that period surprisingly well, really owning a lot of property, because again, New Hampshire has no black people, so they owned nothing. They were just passing through to Canada, right? So in Hopestill Cheswell, he built the John Paul Jones House, and many more houses in the area. And he was really prosperous, and I have to look him up. Talk about him. Valerie knows so much more about, I'm always nervous to talk with Valerie here.
I'm not leaving.
You're not leaving? Hope Still Cheswell was born a free person to Richard Cheswell, an enslaved laborer and a white mother in Exeter, New Hampshire. What's interesting about his state that Hope Still was a free person because his mother was white. If his mother had been black, he would not have been a free person. I don't know if that was the same down south, but that was part of the British rule for enslavement. But so he was a free person of color because his mother was white. Cheswell became the first African American to own property in the U.S. And this is the deed dating 18 October 1717. Is the earliest known deed showing land ownership by a black man in present-day New Hampshire. So that's the deed, the earliest one we have showing Cheswell. Now, Hope Still, he earned enough money as a housewright to purchase a total of more than 100 acres of land between 1773 and 1749, which he farmed and worked, and he also had a mill privilege too, for this lumber for that what he was working. So we see in Hope Still Cheswell not only cementing his place in the town by leaving these buildings that we can still look at today, but also developing other businesses as he went along. Now his son, Wentworth Cheswell, who was born in 1746, he was the only child of Hope Still and Catherine. He became a really well-known person and citizen in Newmarket, New Hampshire. What we have there is that's the first state marker in New Hampshire, the first state historical marker to honor a person of color, which is Wentworth Cheswell. Now Cheswell also, because his father Hope Still was wealthy enough, he went to the Dummer, was it Governor Dummer at the time, because they changed it now. It's Dummer Academy. Not Dummer. It's Governor Dummer, but I think it's just Dummer Academy now. You know, which is a private school. So he was probably, I'm not sure if Paul's went there. Did Paul's go to Dummer? I don't think so. I think he was the first person of color to go to and graduate from Governor Dummer Academy. And there we see another step in a quest for citizenship and the importance of education, where Hope Still enrolls his son in one of the, the highest institutions of the day, learning institutions. Wentworth also held a position. I'm trying to read this, it's so small. Cheswell had a succession of town or local government positions. He was the assessor for the town, he was the town auditor, he was the coroner, and he was also the selectman. And he is on record as the first selectman of color in the state of New Hampshire. So again, and this just brings to mind, just as I'm talking, we do have his marker, but we don't know these stories. For somebody to have so many positions in a town as a man of color, an important role that everybody came to when they had to do town business. We know the nose Cheswell.
The library too.
Yeah, again, like the other man I spoke about, Amos, started a library in the town. What, and as I talk, and if you can think of this and answer, but what did it mean for these men of color to establish libraries, to value education in such a way that it was the, you know, the pinnacle, that you have to be educated in order to belong? What was this quest of belonging and putting your name on something in a town that you were in? What did that mean to that person of color? And then here we are now, still calling New Hampshire the whitest town in the Union. Even today, when we see anything, it's still listed as, in New Hampshire, the whitest state in the Union. I don't know what that means. George Blanchard, from Milford, New Hampshire. He was the town veterinarian. He was a Revolutionary War vet. And this is information that's in the town history book, you know, about George Blanchard. He, like Cheswell, he worked to become a citizen of his state. By not only, he ran a hooperage, he ran a sawmill, he had a boarding house. And this building, right here, was right in downtown Milford. And in looking at the history for Blanchard, when I was reading, the writer of it said that George Blanchard somehow came by this property. You know, or the language we use, he came by this property. Everybody else, they owned this, you know, but he somehow came by this property. But we knew that he was, like I said, a Revolutionary War vet. He was the town veterinarian back in 1800s, and you know, he had all these business right in the center of town. And he, like Amos Fortune, donated a school to the town. And I'll talk a little bit about Blanchard, just this whole notion of remembering and forgetting as we go along. And I'll show you the instances where we use language to minimize the importance of the roles of certain people in town. The next quest that this is my work in progress. Yeah. As I look at this role of citizenship, is the freedom of speech as it's valued as a part of our constitutional right here. I'll talk a little bit about Harriet Wilson, who published this book, Our Nig, or Sketches in the Life of a Free Black, in 1859. Wilson was born in Milford, New Hampshire, and in this book, which is known to be the first novel by a black woman to be published in the U.S., she was born in Milford, New Hampshire, and she writes about her stay with a prominent family of the town as an indentured servant. And she compares in her novel the life of a slave in the South with that of a servant in the North, and saying that there's no difference, you know, that they were treated the same way. Her book talks a lot, it's a very small book that's really packed with scathing commentary on all the valued institution of the time. Sorry, do I need to move that? Should I move it over? Okay. It talks about the hypocrisy of the North, you know, this again comparing the slavery in the North to slavery in the South. She talks about the hypocrisy of the abolitionist movement. She said, you know, they want to free the slave, but they would never have a slave sit by them in their home or in their home. She talks about this whole notion of motherhood, you know, and the church, everything. She takes every institution of the day that was valued by the majority culture, takes a hit in her novel. Oops, how do we go back? Sorry. Okay, so the Milford that Wilson writes about is not different than many of the other towns in New Hampshire. Milford was known as a bastion for the abolitionist movement, you know, just like the rest of the North. You know, it was home to parts of the safe homes for the Underground Railroad. The building at the top, the town hall, hosted one of the biggest abolitionist meeting in the whole state, where Garrison and Frederick Douglass and just about any big name in the abolitionist movement came to that meeting in Milford. You know, we know that they had meetings in Concord, and I'm not sure Portsmouth, but in Exeter, there's this big talk of abolition. And Milford was also home to the Hutchinson family, a famous singing group, part of the anti-slavery movement, who would become internationally known for their singing. They actually went to England and sang for the Queen there. So this environment this story we tell about New England is written everywhere. It's what we know. This is our story of New England. So when Wilson's book come along to tell us that, no, this is not so, it's a more complicated story, and you start looking at things, then you start to unravel that storyline. And you think about stories like when you go on tour in Milford and you hear of the Hutchinson family. You know, the biggest story they tell about the Hutchinson family when you tour the house is that Tom Thumb, part of the Ringling Brothers circus, he rode his carriage through the hallways in the Hutchinson family. But they never ever tell you, it's not part of our dialogue, that Frederick Douglass slept in that house. And I think when it comes to the culture of the American culture, the American story, if that part of that history was more told, we would be weaving that story in a truer way, in a more complex way, and not the lightness of the Barnum and Bailey circus, but the real story that is American story, the part that is about slavery and abolition and blacks and whites, which is a more complex story. Oh, goodness. Wilson's, this whole notion of freedom too, and freedom of speech and freedom to travel and freedom to be who you are, in the time when Wilson wrote her novel and published it, in 1859, the Fugitive Slave Law was reinforced. And we see that with the Ona Marie Judd story, and we see it here with Wilson, that any person or escaped slave could be picked up, they had the safeguard, be picked up and returned to the South, to their masters, or to anybody who would claim them at that time, actually, through the legal process of the law in the U.S. in 1859, the Fugitive Slave Act. So let's say, for instance, Harriet Wilson, who may not have a birth certificate or no way to prove who she was. You know, she's going, knocking on doors, selling her books, and she could be picked up and sold into slavery in the South. So any free person of color was in fear of being sold into the South through the Fugitive Slave Law. And it was also a time for the Dred Scott case that said that a person of color was not a citizen. They were not allowed to go into the courts the way somebody else could. The Dred Scott Law said you were not a citizen of the U.S. And that was one of the things in the letter that George Washington sent, trying to get Ona Marie back, was that Whipple said, well, let's go to court and argue this case so that, that if she loses, she goes back to you. He would have used, giving her the right of citizenship, which George Washington in that letter kindly ignored because he didn't want to bring attention to this whole fight for his enslaved person to come back. I'll tell you how I got involved in this whole story here of blacks in New Hampshire was in 2002. There was an article in the newspaper that said the first black woman to publish a novel from Milford, New Hampshire. And that was the first time I knew that New Hampshire even had a black history, much less that it was right here in my state, in the town that I lived in. So what I did, along with, we have two members here from the Harriet Wilson Project. We formed the Harriet Wilson Project to raise awareness for Harriet Wilson in our state and in our town. And we found, through looking for Wilson, some of the sites that were directly related to her. The school that she attended, the church where the reverend was that married her, and through the work from Cunningham and Pitts, we found her death certificate, which said where she was buried in Massachusetts. So for me, this was the visual confirmation of a person of color's life, not only in the state, in the town in which I lived, but in the state. And that she went on to be this real famous person, created that history that I was looking for in a town. This here is the house that she talks about, where she was an indentured servant to in Milford. Wilson's story, I have handouts that you can have. She was born in Milford in 1825. She lived with the Hayward family. And the story that she writes in our book, R&A, closely resembles her life. So there was talk, and a lot of the other stuff was found by scholars and researchers after Gates, Henry Louis Gates published her book in 1983, and really he's the one who did a lot of work to prove that she was a woman, a person of color. She started a business selling hair products in 1857 through 1860. And this is one of the other things that we see here. People of color working to not only sustain their own lives, but create this entrepreneurial spirit in being productive citizens in the state. There was when we first found this information on her being an entrepreneur, we thought there were these little bottles that she did hair dyes and stuff, and she would sell them from door to door. We thought it was a little tiny business. But through Gabrielle Foreman, she found an ad in a Philadelphia paper that had 15,000 bottles for sale. So she had a big business going. It wasn't a little tiny business. So again, she joins people like Cheswell, and Blanchard in pursuing work, business for themselves in their quest for self-identity and for being, valid citizens in their town. What we did for the Harriet Wilson project was to memorialize Wilson in her hometown, and that's the first monument to a person of color in the state of New Hampshire that we unveiled in 2006 in Wilson's hometown in honor of Wilson, and making that history visible and permanent was our goal as we did this. Pretty much what the African Burial Ground is going to do for the history here in Portsmouth when the monument is up for the burial ground is to make that history, and it's really fitting that we're doing a burial ground in Portsmouth, the first port for this Black history, first and last, and it's coming up. But making that history visible and permanent says a lot. It goes a long way into weaving the Black history and culture into the full picture, the full story of the American story. It will become, once a monument goes up, it'll become part of of Portsmouth story, and nobody can say that they didn't know anymore, even though there's a marker that's on a building that was there in 2000 next to the burial ground. And when that was dug up for the pipes to go in 2003, everybody was surprised that they found bodies there. It begs to the question: what do we remember and what do we choose to forget? And I'll talk a little bit about that wedding, that not only the myth, but what we're wedded to in the story of New England, that story of New Hampshire. And I'll just throw it out and ask, why is it important for us to keep that story of New Hampshire, New England, as a place, first of all, devoid of people of color, a place where slavery never existed? Why is it that we have to keep New Hampshire white? What does that tell us? Just another view of the monument. This is Wilson's, the bottles and the ad for Wilson's hair products that Gabrielle found. One of the other stories that really fascinates me in our quest for education, and that is a real big part of New Hampshire's story that is not told, is the story of Noyes Academy in Canaan. And I'm sure, does anybody know the story of Noyes Academy? Okay. Well, Noyes Academy was the first academy. It was not quite a college, and it was not high school, but in that day it would have been considered the first college. But it was the first integrated college, place of higher learning in the New England states, where started by Mr. Kimball, who was an abolitionist in Canaan, New Hampshire. He had this notion that he could start an integrated school, not only to show that blacks were capable of higher learning, but also, that it was possible. And he talked his town into, at a town meeting, they agreed with him that this could be done because this is New England. We can have this integrated school, and we're abolitionists, so it will look good. They enrolled 12 students from New York, 12 black students from New York, and I think 20 white students were enrolled in this school. It was built in Canaan, and the whole story of how the blacks got to Canaan is interesting too, because they couldn't use the same mode of transportation as whites. People had to walk or took ships, and just their journey to Canaan, New Hampshire was a story in itself. But Noyes Academy was set up to teach Latin, higher math, and I forgot the other subject. But what was interesting about Noyes Academy, that it lasted for just under a year. It was torn down by men from the towns all around. It was taken off of its foundation by 90 oxen. It was dragged through town and dumped in the swamp and later burned. The story is that, of course, the idea of equalness is different than the actual seeing of equalness. So the notion when it was just an idea, it was okay with the town, but when they actually saw men of color, women of color, white women, black women mingling in the same place, then the fear arose that there were going to be more blacks in town, there was going to be amalgamation, there was going, whatever white fear was at the time, and the school was destroyed. Noyes Academy's story didn't even just end back then in 1843. The building in red, the Kimball House, we tried to save this house. Was it 3 years ago now, Harry? Yeah, around 3 years ago. Now, the building in red there, that was the dormitory for the school. And we couldn't get any interest in saving this building. It too ended up pretty much like the school. It was taken apart and destroyed and moved. Again, there wasn't that interest in saving. I can't even imagine if it had been any other thing. If it had been a French school, let's just say French. That was the first of its kind that it wouldn't want to be saved. But again, the story of slavery and racism is so complex that it's better not telling it. It's better to erase that story than try to tell it, because it then asks us to reimagine New England. What is that story we tell and sell about New England? Our quintessential New England town. Because once we introduce the story of slavery and the story of blackness, it complicates that picture.
And the fact that some of the young men and one of the young women who attended Noyes Academy as that experimental class turned out to be extremely important people. Even though they got kicked out of there, they went on someplace else and became leaders in their time.
Yeah, and that I was just going to talk about that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Henry Garnett, out of that school, and gosh, if we ever could get a film, if anybody was here for our last film discussion, if we could get somebody to do a film on Noyes Academy, it would be a really good story, because it even have a love story in it. But Garnett and Cromwell, Alexander Cromwell and Henry Garnett, were both young men around, I think Garnett was around 18 years of age when he went to Noyes Academy. They came to New Hampshire from New York, and these two men would go on to be prominent men not only in the abolitionist movement, but in the movement for education as well. And I think Garnett was part of that Back to Africa movement. They went on to form churches and be orators, and just their story, I have like 6 pages of their story, but Garnett was an abolitionist speaker all over the world, and very political about his opinions and his ways, and so was Cromwell. And I would like to think that they said, Garnett, when they were destroying after the mob had destroyed the school, they came back with their guns to fire on the students in the dormitory. And Garnett, and you just have to think of this, an 18-year-old black man surrounded by white people, he actually fired back in the crowd, and that allowed the other people in the dorm, the other people of color, to escape through the barn, and then they kind of got out of town after that. But his boldness, his courage, his intellect, his desire for freedom is totally prominent in that story in Noyes Academy, and I think that experience that he had there propelled him on to the fame that he got later on. Is it good for New Hampshire? I don't know, but it tells the story not only of New Hampshire but America's story, And I think if the American stories that you can succeed against all odds, or you can, anybody can do anything in America, that it's in their story, so we can tell these stories as part of the American story, the success stories, even as we tell the underbelly story, the darker side of the American story. This is just when we look at these men's journey into citizenship, what they did, and I wonder why we don't know about their stories, why their stories weren't a part of the New Hampshire story or the bigger picture. As we know, Cromwell and Garnett, their stories are big, but why doesn't New Hampshire know their story? Then we come to these stories of other people of prominence in the town. We see it on the small scale, and then we see it on a bigger scale. George Blanchard, that I told you about, the veterinarian for the town, it says George Blanchard, a colored man and a veterinary surgeon, came to the town, came to Milford in, I can't see the year, 1824, and that was in the first writing of the Milford history. Tells of and it tells us that he's a colored man, and I want to know, why is it important to also that we identify him as a colored man, right? But by the telling, the next writing of the Milford history, it says there were no veterinarians in Milford before 1899. None. Completely wipes out George Blanchard's existence in the town history. And the new writing was also where it said that he somehow came by that property, Here is a more recent retelling of the erasure of a black history. This forgetting. We're in the Hippo magazine, contemporary paper out of Manchester, when they were talking about multicultural Manchester. For most of its history, Manchester, like the rest of New Hampshire, has been lily white in its makeup. And it goes on to say that Irish, French, Italians were a part of there, but people of colors were not. And this is, contemporary paper, again, erasing, in our current day, we're erasing that history, that people of color did not live in New Hampshire. And this is my most recent find. This is I was looking for citizenship, what it means to be a citizen of the state. And this is on a government website for kids, And it said, except for Native Americans, the United States is a nation of people who left their home country looking for a better life. For this reason, the United States is sometimes called the melting pot. As a result, the population of the United States is made up of a mixture of people from different countries, such as Ireland, China, and Mexico. Again, a clear erasure of a black history. I mean, at least Native Americans get a mention there, but we know that their history was also erased. But they got a mention. There is nothing for people of color. Asians get a mention because they came from China. But the people, and of course, we completely wipe out that story of slavery in that first sentence. That it's a nation of people who left their home country looking for a better life. I think these things can really tell us why we have a group of people that will question somebody's citizenship, like the president's, through a birth certificate. Because I don't think, and we just have to ask why that there even exists that group that would question. If he looked somewhere else, would they question it? And this is in our journey for when we were looking at George Blanchard, and we found his burial plot. I thought we would only, we would only find one spot, that would say George Blanchard, but we found the whole family, a pretty big part of his family buried in the town cemetery. And first of all, I was excited to find this, but in looking at the story, and just looking at the cemetery, you would say, well, it's really not important because they don't tell, the markers don't tell us, what color the person was or where they came from. It just, and is that important for it to say that this is a man of color who is buried here? Knowing his story makes it important because it then tells us that yes, blacks they were born here and they died and they got buried here, And in George's case, inside the cemetery, not outside of the cemetery, so we could find him. Unlike the souls of the people buried in Portsmouth, there is no marker there, without that map from the 1700s that said this was the Negro burial ground. We could have completely, or if they didn't go and unfortunately dug the bones up, we could have wiped that memory out completely of that black culture here in New Hampshire. But all of this then asks the question, for me, one, how do we tell the story of blacks, and why is it important to tell the stories of black in New Hampshire? What does it do for us to know this history? I ask that question. For me, I know it creates the sense of a connection to a past, a sense of belonging, that you walk differently when you're in the town. You know that people who looked like you walked in that town shared some of the things, and this is how I felt when I discovered Wilson. You know, oh my goodness, she walked out, she could have walked the street, she could have passed here. She just, you know, it created that sense of belonging. But what does it do to our majority culture to know that these stories exist? What does it tell us about us as Americans, as citizens, to know these other stories? What story does it tell us about slavery, the enslaved, about us now? Those are just some of my questions and my search to find out what that means. And if we look at, if these stories more integrated in our schools, more a part of our dialogue, then would we really need markers to tell that story? And as we go along, we find out that there's more of these stories. Every time we turn around and we turn one page, there is somebody else's story to tell you. These are just a few of the stories of people of color in the state of New Hampshire. But there are many more that we're uncovering as we go daily, and more makes the story of New Hampshire much more complex and more inclusive as we uncover these stories. And so that's my presentation, but I do want to ask, I really want to know, does it make a difference to know these stories? And what it does?
I would suggest that if these stories were taught in social studies, that the high school students would be way more interested in taking social studies. I read the whole book, well, I didn't read it all, but the introduction was, you know, why do students in high school like social studies the least of all? And that's because the publishers have whitewashed everything about our history and made it so dull. And as soon as you hear the nuances of all of it, it would and does make it come alive, and the different point of view of, and why I just think that New Hampshire is, we all do want to be on the right side of history, so we don't want it, we don't like gray, we just like, you know, sort of our heroes and our demons and nothing in between.
Truth could be told, because the history of America is a lie. When you talk about who comes to this country for freedom, for enjoyment, well, Mexico, if you know, that's part of America. America took that like it took all of the land. My grandmother's people were here before the ships docked, and she could tell me all about what happened here. And they're still on reservations. That's in encampment. That's in prison. Still reservations exist in this country.
I have a question to ask you, and the question is, you presented us with some questions, and the questions had something like this. Why was it? It appears a concentrated effort to erase any suggestion that this area had a black heritage or whatever. Why did that happen, and who allowed it to happen, and whatever? Do you ever get an answer? Maybe not tonight, but when you're talking, does anyone ever say to you, well, I'll tell you why. Did anyone ever?
Not really why, but we have, you know, we can talk about ideas.
Why do they
I mean,
think?
one of the interesting notion of New England is when we advertise now, right? If you look at any tourist brochure of New Hampshire, New England, come to quintessential New England, you know, rolling hills, you know, quaint houses, you know. How can we interject the story of slavery in that brochure? How can we, once we interject the story of blacks in that story, then we become America. right? The problem of racism, the problems of blacks. What does it mean if that is erased from a culture? You know, what are we selling? We're selling something that never even was, right? It was never the way that New England or any place in the U.S. was free of blacks or free of slavery or free of racism. But it's economically advantageous for us to create that image in New England. That's just one of the stories. Because if there is not that history, we don't have to tell it. That question never has to come up.
The slogan for the New Hampshire Tourism Bureau, just a few years ago, in the 2000s, was, "It's right in New Hampshire." Think about that. It's right in New Hampshire. It means all kinds of things.
I mean, there's the saying, if you're white, step, you're right. If you're white, you're right. If you're black, step back. If you're, what's in between?
Brown.
If you're brown, stick around. That's it. So if you're white, you're right. If you're black, step back. And if you're brown, stick around.
Jerry, I watching TV this past week when the new pope was announced. One of the news commentators made this statement. He said, "We noticed that the black smoke that came out the chimney was bad. White smoke is good." And when I heard that, I was at the beginning. I wanted to see who said it, but it had shifted something else. And I mean, this is what passed on, because I'm sure school children were watching this as well.
How
You know,
about
the
cowboy hats? The way
black
that
cowboy,
black hat.
white cowboy hat.
And it was funny, I just did an interview on the radio because we were talking about the 1779 petition. And I was asked, so why is it important? They're dead, so why should we even, they're free, they're dead, so why should we even worry about it? Shouldn't we, as an organization, when he was talking to me, be worrying about how to change blacks from being on welfare and how to prevent them from committing crimes? And I said, well, this is exactly what this does. It tells us, it helps to change the stereotypes of what it means to be black in a culture that sees you as less than equal, So the more, for me, the more we tell these stories, is the more like the majority culture, more human everybody becomes. And the more we tell the story of New England with its complexity, it doesn't become just a place, it becomes a human story that no, it wasn't always good and it's not all bad. It has these complexities and it creates a truer fabric on which the culture is built, not just the lie that, it is the whitest state in the Union. Were you going to say something?
No.
Okay.
No.
Oh, you had your hand out.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's, thank you.
But I will say one thing now, speaking in terms of the black smoke and the white smoke. A number of years ago, we were actually attending church in Kittery, and we were only maybe one or two black families in the church. And the minister was talking that Sunday, and in one of the illustrations he made, he said, you think of the story of the cowboys and the Indians. The good guys wore the white hats, and the bad guys wore it, and he looked up and he saw her sitting out there, and he said, some other color hat.
But you'd be surprised how many black describe good things and white talk, like white lie, black lie. The only thing I remember that being good, saying black, is when you were in the black, and you make show you made a good profit or something. So that's happened to be positive.
I think in China it's the opposite.
In the what?
In China,
In child is
It's
when
the
they make a
opposite.
profit?
Yeah, white is death usually.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's right, the
Yeah.
brides wear red.
Yeah.
I think another answer to the question about why this has been erased is that, to borrow from Albert Gore, I guess he was the one who coined the phrase, the inconvenient truth. Yeah, if it doesn't fit this narrative, then you just ignore it. The same thing with the Rosa Parks story, you know? Everybody simplifies the story, oh, she was just tired one day and didn't feel like moving, and,
Yes.
you know, so without ignoring the fact that she had dedicated her life and her intellect, along with the community, to planning this bus boycott, that it didn't just happen because she was tired one day. So it's more convenient to say, oh, she just didn't feel like moving. Because how could she possibly have been planning this?
Yeah.
Yeah, she would have the mindset to do that, you know.
And the community just all of a sudden got so excited about it that the next day they decided to boycott all the buses.
And that's a big part of the abolitionist story too.
Yeah.
Blacks were not abolitionists, they were just the escaped runaway slaves, you know? Whereas we know that there was a strong group of black abolitionists, actually the first abolitionists, you know, working to free their family. So,
Thank you.
thank you, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Your story needs to be told again and again.
Yeah, and that's where we were trying, you know, stay here. Yeah, anyplace else, so where we're gonna go.